At around 4 in the morning on a cold January night in southeastern Ohio, a cattle farmer named Roy Denniston woke up to a sound he later described as the earth clearing its throat. By the time he got outside with a flashlight, a section of his back pasture roughly 60 feet across had dropped nearly 20 feet straight down, taking a fence line, a stretch of grazing ground, and the corner of an old equipment shed with it. Nobody was hurt, no cattle were lost, but by sunrise, state geologists were already on their way, and what they found once they started digging into the history of that land had almost nothing to do with the explanation most people reach for first. My name is Marlo Reed. When a hole opens in the ground like that, the instinct almost everyone has, myself included the first time I heard about this, is to assume it's a sinkhole in the classic sense, limestone dissolving slowly underground until the roof of a cavity finally gives way. That explanation is real, and it happens across a huge stretch of this country. But it is not what happened on Roy Denniston's farm, and the actual cause tells you something uncomfortable about a few 100,000 acres of land across Appalachia that most of the people living on it have never thought twice about, the explanation everyone reaches for first. Before I get into what actually happened here, it's worth spending a minute on why the karst explanation is the one everybody's mind jumps to, because that assumption isn't unreasonable. Sinkholes caused by dissolving limestone are a genuinely well-documented phenomenon across a huge portion of the eastern and southeastern United States. Florida sits almost entirely on a limestone platform, and the mechanism there is straightforward once you understand it. Rainwater picks up a small amount of carbon dioxide as it falls and becomes mildly acidic. Over centuries, that acidic water works through cracks in limestone bedrock, slowly widening them into channels and eventually into open voids. When the roof of one of those voids gets thin enough, gravity finishes the job, and the ground above collapses without warning. That process is real, it's well understood, and it produces genuine sinkholes across a band of the country that includes parts of Kentucky, Tennessee, and a strip of western Ohio near the Indiana border where limestone bedrock does sit close to the surface. If you had asked a geologist with no other information where a sudden hole in an Ohio pasture came from, karst dissolution would be a completely reasonable first guess. And in a meaningful share of cases across the state, it would even be the correct one. The problem is that Roy Denniston's farm sits in Belmont County, in the far eastern part of the state near the Ohio River, and the bedrock underneath that particular stretch of ground is not limestone at all. It's a sequence of shale, sandstone, and coal, laid down during the Pennsylvanian period roughly 300 million years ago, the same geological formation that made this part of Ohio, along with the neighboring hills of West Virginia and western Pennsylvania, one of the most heavily mined coal regions in American history. And that distinction, shale and sandstone instead of limestone, changes the entire explanation for what happened underneath that pasture. What the state survey actually found, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources sent a team from its Division of Geological Survey within 2 days of the collapse, standard procedure for a sinkhole event of this size on private agricultural land. Their first move, before anyone descended into the hole or ran any instruments, was to pull the county's mining records, because in Ohio's coal belt, that's a routine first step that would never even occur to a survey team working a similar looking hole in Florida. What they found in those records took less than an afternoon to locate, and it explained the collapse almost completely before a single soil sample was taken. Roy Denniston's back pasture sat directly above a section of the Kemp coal mine, an underground room and pillar operation that had extracted coal from a seam roughly 80 feet below the surface between 1911 and 1938. The mine had been abandoned for close to 90 years, sealed and largely forgotten, its surface entrances graded over and grown in with the same kind of scrub timber that covers most of the hillsides in this part of the state. Room and pillar mining, for anyone unfamiliar with it, works by carving out a grid of tunnels, the rooms, while leaving thick columns of uncut coal, the pillars standing at regular intervals to hold up the rock above. It was the dominant coal mining method in Appalachia for most of the 19th and 20th centuries, and when it's done with generous pillar spacing and the mine stays dry, it can remain structurally stable for a genuinely long time. When it isn't, and when groundwater gets into a mine that was never designed to stay flooded, those pillars degrade. Coal left in place underground for a century does not behave the way people assume solid rock behaves. It's still an organic material, and under sustained moisture and pressure, it slowly crushes, crumbles, and loses load-bearing strength. The economics of the era shaped how generously or how tightly those pillars were spaced in the first place, and that detail matters more than it might seem. A mining company in 1911 made money on the coal it extracted, not on the coal it left behind holding up the roof, which created a persistent incentive to cut pillars as thin as engineers of the time judged safe, sometimes thinner. Mining engineering in that period was based on rule-of-thumb calculations and accumulated field experience rather than the kind of rigorous structural modeling available today, and margins of safety that seem adequate by 1911 standards do not always hold up under a century of continued load and shifting groundwater. This is not a story about anyone at the Kemp mine cutting corners maliciously. It's a story about engineering judgment from a different era, meaning 100 years of geological reality it was never designed to withstand. The state survey team's working conclusion, confirmed over the following weeks with borehole sampling and a review of the mine's original engineering plans, was that a section of pillars roughly 80 feet under Roy Deniston's pasture had been slowly failing for years, possibly decades, under the combined weight of the overlying rock and a rising water table that the original mine engineers in 1911 had no reason to anticipate would ever be a problem. When enough of those pillars finally gave out simultaneously, the rock layers above them lost their support and came down in what geologists call a collapsed chimney, a column of failure that worked its way upward through 80 feet of shale and sandstone until it finally broke through into daylight in the middle of a cattle pasture. That is not a sinkhole in the sense most people picture. There was no slow dissolution of rock, no acid eating through limestone over geological time. There was a mine, dug by hand and mule over a century ago, quietly losing its structural integrity underground while 3 generations of Deniston family farmed the ground above it with no idea what was happening beneath their boots. Why nobody saw this coming. This is the part of the story that I think deserves more attention than the hole itself, because the honest answer to why nobody saw this coming is uncomfortable in a specific way. It is not that the information didn't exist. It's that the information existed in a form nobody was required to check. Ohio's coal mining boom, like most of Appalachia's, predates most modern regulatory frameworks by decades. The Kemp coal mine that sat under Roy Deniston's pasture was one of literally thousands of small and mid-sized operations that opened, extracted what coal was economically reachable, and closed within a few decades, often leaving behind paper records that were incomplete even when they were first filed. Mine maps from this era were drawn by hand, filed with whatever state mining office existed at the time, and in many cases simply lost, damaged, or never properly indexed, as ownership of the coal company changed hands or the company folded outright. The Ohio Department of Natural Resources today maintains an abandoned underground mine database that geologists rely on for exactly this kind of investigation, and it is, by the department's own acknowledgement, incomplete. Estimates place the number of abandoned underground coal mines across the state somewhere in the range of several thousand, and a meaningful percentage of those have mine maps that are partial, degraded, or missing entirely. A farm changes hands, a mortgage gets approved, a barn gets built, all without anyone consulting a hand-drawn map from 1911 that may or may not still exist in a filing cabinet, because in most cases there is no legal requirement to do so before ordinary agricultural or residential land use. It's worth pointing out that the Kemp Mines records actually did survive in reasonably legible condition, which is part of why the survey team was able to identify the cause so quickly once they knew where to look. In a meaningful number of comparable cases across the region, the records simply aren't there anymore. Lost to fires, floods, office moves, or the ordinary decay of paper stored in unheated buildings for a century. When that happens, a geological survey team investigating a collapse has to reconstruct the mining history through indirect means. Old aerial photographs showing surface entrances long since grown over oral history from longtime residents who remember where their grandparents said the mine openings used to be. Sometimes nothing more reliable than that. Roy Deniston's case, in an odd way, was one of the more straightforward ones precisely because the paperwork happened to survive. Roy Denniston told the survey team, and later a local reporter, that he had farmed that pasture for over 30 years, and his father had farmed it for decades before that. Neither of them had any reason to know a mine existed underneath it. The land above ground gave no indication. There was no subsidence crack, no depression in the grass, nothing that would have prompted anyone to go looking through county mining archives on the off chance something was wrong 80 feet down. The mechanics of a slow collapse. I want to walk through why this kind of failure tends to happen suddenly rather than gradually, because it's a genuinely interesting piece of engineering, and it explains why a mine can sit stable for 80 years and then fail within what was likely a matter of hours or days. A coal pillar under sustained load doesn't fail all at once under normal circumstances. It creeps. Under constant pressure from the rock above, the coal slowly deforms, losing a small amount of strength over months and years as microscopic fractures accumulate inside it. For a long time, that process is essentially invisible from the surface because the remaining pillars in the surrounding grid pick up the extra load and the overall system stays in equilibrium. This is, structurally speaking, very similar to what engineers see in aging bridges and parking garages, where individual support members can degrade substantially before the structure, as a whole, shows any visible sign of distress. The problem comes when multiple pillars in the same area cross their failure threshold at roughly the same time. Because coal pillars in a grid don't fail independently of each other, when one pillar in a row weakens and starts to lose height under the load, the rock above it settles slightly, and that settlement redistributes stress onto the neighboring pillars, which accelerates their own creep failure. It's a feedback loop, and once it starts in earnest, it can move from barely detectable to catastrophic in a surprisingly short window. Groundwater intrusion accelerates this dramatically because water weakens coal's compressive strength significantly, sometimes by well over half compared to dry coal under laboratory testing. The original Kemp mine engineers, in 1911, designed their pillar spacing based on dry mine assumptions that made sense for the water table conditions of that era. A century of shifting groundwater patterns, including changes tied to regional strip mining operations decades later that altered drainage across the wider area, put that mine under conditions its original design never accounted for. Once the failing pillars in that section of the Kemp mine crossed their threshold, the rock layers immediately above them lost support essentially all at once, and the resulting void began migrating upward through the overlying shale and sandstone in the collapsed chimney I mentioned earlier. Each layer that failed left a gap above it with nothing beneath to support it, so the failure propagated upward, layer by layer, roughly 80 feet, until it finally broke the surface at 4 a.m. in Roy Denniston's pasture. Geologists estimate, based on the geometry of the void and the thickness of the overlying rock, that this entire upward propagation likely took somewhere between several hours and a couple of days, which lines up with the detail Denniston mentioned to the survey team almost as an afterthought. He said his cattle had been unusually agitated the evening before the collapse, moving away from that section of pasture without any obvious reason. Whether that was coincidence or the animals picking up on subtle ground vibration too faint for a person to notice is not something anyone can confirm, and I want to be honest that this detail sits in the category of interesting but unverifiable rather than established fact. What this means beyond one farm here is where this stops being a story about one collapsed pasture and starts being a story with real implications for a large stretch of the country, because Belmont County is not unique. The same Pennsylvanian age coal seams that were mined under Roy Denniston's land extend across roughly 24 counties in eastern and southeastern Ohio, and the identical geology continues into West Virginia, western Pennsylvania, and eastern Kentucky. The total footprint of documented and undocumented abandoned underground coal mines across central Appalachia runs into the tens of thousands, sitting beneath farmland, residential subdivisions, highways, and in some well-documented cases, entire town centers that grew up directly above 19th century mine workings, without anyone involved in the later development having full knowledge of what was underneath. Ohio does have a mine subsidence insurance program administered separately from standard homeowners policies, specifically because standard property insurance in the state, like in most states, generally excludes ground subsidence and earth movement as a covered peril. It's a program most residents of the coal belt know exists in the abstract, in the same way most people know flood insurance exists, without necessarily connecting that knowledge to their own specific property until something happens. Roy Denniston, by his own account, did not carry mine subsidence coverage because in over 3 decades of farming that land, nothing had ever suggested he needed to consider it. The Ohio Geological Survey has, since this collapse became a documented case study within the department, begun cross-referencing known agricultural and residential parcels against the abandoned mine database with renewed urgency in counties where the records are known to be weakest. That is meaningful, careful work, and it is also work that cannot move quickly because it depends on physically locating and digitizing paper records that in some cases have not been handled in decades. Some of them water damaged, some incomplete from the moment they were originally filed by mining companies that had no long-term incentive to produce a perfectly accurate record of ground they consider themselves finished with. There's a broader pattern worth naming here, and I think it's worth naming plainly rather than dancing around it. For roughly a century, the economic value extracted from Appalachian coal seams flowed largely outward, to mining companies, to industrial centers, to the broader national economy that ran on that coal. What stayed behind once the seams were exhausted and the companies moved on or dissolved was the physical legacy of that extraction sitting quietly underground, unmapped in many cases, unmonitored in nearly all of them, and left for the people who continued living and farming and building on the surface above to eventually discover, sometimes literally overnight, exactly what they had inherited. The families still farming this land, generations removed from the mining boom itself, are the ones now absorbing a risk that was created by an industry, a set of engineering assumptions, and a regulatory environment that in most cases no longer exists in any form they could hold accountable. Roy Denniston is not going to get a check from the company that operated the Kemp mine in 1911, because that company has not existed for the better part of a century. What he gets is a state geological survey team, a repaired fence line, and the knowledge that 80 feet beneath the rest of his pasture there may be more of the same waiting. What is actually being done? I don't want to leave this story sitting purely in the uncomfortable territory, because there is real methodical work happening in response to exactly this kind of event, and it deserves to be described accurately rather than left implied. The Ohio Department of Natural Resources Division of Mineral Resources Management maintains and continues to expand a geographic information system layer specifically mapping known abandoned mine boundaries against modern property records, a project that has been underway in some form for years, but has received renewed funding attention following documented collapse events like this one. Federal money also flows into this work through the Abandoned Mine Land Program, originally established to address environmental hazards like acid mine drainage and unstable mine openings, and increasingly applied to subsidence risk mapping as more of these collapse events get documented and studied in detail. The geologists who worked the Denniston site have also pushed, through professional channels rather than press releases, for expanded requirements around mine record disclosure during property transactions in counties with known historical mining activity, similar to how flood zone disclosure already works in much of the country. That is not a small procedural suggestion. It would mean that a farm changing hands in Belmont County, or any of the 24 comparable counties across the region, would come with a documented check against the abandoned mine database before sale closes, rather than relying on the accumulated, often incomplete local knowledge that currently stands in for that kind of formal review. None of this moves quickly, and I don't want to oversell how far along it is. Digitizing and cross-referencing a century of hand-drawn mine maps against modern property boundaries across dozens of counties is exactly the kind of unglamorous, resource-intensive work that competes for funding against more visible priorities every budget cycle. But it is happening, and events like the one on Roy Denniston's farm are, in an uncomfortable but genuinely useful way, part of what keeps that work funded and prioritized rather than quietly shelved. The bigger picture I keep coming back to something as I put this story together, and it's a version of something I've said on this channel before in a different context, but it holds up again here. Roy Denniston farmed that land his entire adult life. His father farmed it before him. From the surface, that pasture looked exactly like every other pasture on that ridge, grass and fence line, and the ordinary business of raising cattle, with nothing to suggest that 80 feet down, a set of coal pillars cut by hand more than a century ago were slowly losing a structural battle that had been running since before anyone currently alive on that property was born. The instinct, when a hole like this opens up, is to reach for the explanation that fits the pattern we already know: karst, limestone, water-dissolving rock over geological time. That explanation is real, and it accounts for a great many sinkholes across this country, and it's the one that dominates news coverage whenever a dramatic collapse makes headlines, because dissolving limestone photographs well and fits a familiar narrative about coastlines and climate. But it would have been the wrong explanation here, and getting the explanation wrong isn't just an academic error. It changes what you look for next, what land you flag is at risk, what records you go digging through, and ultimately whether the next farmer whose pasture starts sounding strange at 4 a.m. gets a warning before it happens, or a phone call from a geological survey team afterward. Roy Denniston's farm is back in operation. The hole has been fenced off, monitored, and is not being actively filled, since geologists want to continue studying how the collapsed chimney settles over time before deciding on a permanent remediation plan. His cattle graze the rest of the pasture, as they always have, but he told the local reporter who covered the story something I keep thinking about, which is that he now walks that field differently than he did before. Not out of fear exactly, but out of a kind of attention he never used to think he needed. He said he finds himself listening to the ground now, the way you'd listen to a house settle at night, aware for the first time in 30 years that the quiet under his boots was never actually empty. That's the thing about this particular kind of ground failure that I think separates it from the more dramatic, more publicized sinkhole stories people are used to hearing about. This wasn't nature doing something ancient and indifferent to human presence. This was the direct, physical, decades-delayed consequence of a very specific human decision made in 1911 by people who could not have known, and likely never asked, what the ground would do a century after they walked away from it. The coal is gone. The company is gone. The engineers who drew those original pillar spacing plans have been dead for the better part of a century. What's left is 80 feet of quietly failing rock, under working farmland, waiting, in this case, until 4 a.m. on a cold night in January to finally announce itself. There's a version of this story playing out in some earlier or later stage under an unknown number of other properties across the same coal belt right now, properties where nobody has had their 4 a.m. wake-up call yet, where the pillars are still creeping toward failure at whatever pace the local groundwater and rock conditions dictate, unnoticed because nothing about the surface has changed yet. That's not meant to alarm anyone reading a property listing in eastern Ohio next week. Most of these old mines really did stay stable, and plenty of them will remain that way indefinitely. But the honest statistical reality is that nobody, not the state survey, not the insurance industry, not the families living on this land, currently has a complete picture of which properties fall into which category, and that gap is exactly what the ongoing mapping work is trying to close, one county and one incomplete paper record at a time. I am Marlo Reed. If stories like this one, the ones where the real explanation turns out to be more human and more overlooked than the first assumption everyone reaches for, are why you keep coming back to this channel, subscribe, because the ground under a lot of this country has more history in it than most of us were ever told, and I intend to keep digging through it. I'll see you in the next one.